I have this ability to remember obscure trivia and random nonsense that most people don't care for. But the other day at work, I managed to do the unthinkable, and I knew something that people actually wanted to know more about. You see, I revealed to a friend about the forgotten animated Lord of the Rings movies. To most people, there's 3 movies from Peter Jackson for the Lord of the Rings and 3 for The Hobbit, and there's nothing beyond that. But the actual truth is that during the 1970s, we got not 1, not 2, but 3 movies adapting Tolkien's books in their own unique ways. But most people today won't know about them. And the reason is because these are some of the strangest and ugliest adaptations you could ever hope for. My name is Pepperjack, and today I will reveal to you the animated Lord of the Rings movies that we forgot about, and why that might be a good thing. It's the 1960s. Middle-earth is rising in popularities, and filmmakers want a slice of the pie. Tolkien and his publishers are busy battling them off left and right, until eventually a company named United Artists sits down to negotiate. As Tolkien's publisher recalls in his memoirs, it took them 2 years to negotiate a contract that signed over the film, stage, and merchandising rights. In fact, that contract gave them the right to modify Tolkien's works as they saw fit, and it's still in effect today. But that's a story for another time. United Artists set to work adapting Tolkien's movie as quickly as they could. They chose to hire one John Boorman to write the script. Boorman would go on to direct Zardoz and Excalibur, but at this point in time he was trying his best to show off his writing chops. And these weren't very good chops. He made a number of strange choices, from having the Hobbit be played by children in fake beards to all the elves be portrayed by women. But he took a number of significant liberties with the story. To name just a few of them, the trip to Rivendell would have been a drunken vacation at Gandalf's insistence. Arwen would have been a 13-year-old spirit guide, Aragorn would have married Éowyn on the battlefield, Galadriel would have seduced Frodo while he was in Lothlorien, and the Fellowship would have buried Gimli in a hole in the ground and beaten him over the head until he remembered the ancient dwarven language needed to enter the western gate of Moria. Thankfully, this script never made it to production. But while UA tried their best to make a licensed adaptation of Middle-earth, NBC aired an unlicensed adaptation of The Hobbit, courtesy of one Rankin Bass Studios. Now, how did an unlicensed adaptation manage to make it on national television? Well, as Arthur Rankin, who portrays the Rankin in The Rankin Bass, recalls.
Most of the books were under copyright. We approached the copyright holders and they wouldn't let us touch anything until I pointed out that 2 of them were in the public domain in the United States. And the only other ones we were seeking for the other 2. And they said, no, you can't do that, and you can't even use the public domain works. But of course we could. Legally it was right. So we did The Hobbit.
The Hobbit was published stateside in 1938, and at that time the copyright was only granted for 28 years unless the publisher applied for an extension. Based on that date, the book would have entered the public domain in 1966 unless they hadn't run into any other copyright hiccups. It cost Rankin Bass $3 million to make the film, and they obtained a sponsorship from Xerox in order to offset that cost. This is the same Xerox that you know for copy machines, and yes, this is the same Rankin Bass that gave us Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Frosty the Snowman. But unlike its stop-motion compatriots, this movie is completely animated in traditional 2D, courtesy of Topcraft, a studio who would go on to animate Nausicaa in The Valley of the Wind, and then become Studio Ghibli, if you can believe it. So with an animated origin tied to these animated classics, can someone explain why Bilbo looks like this? So with an origin tied to these animated classics, can someone explain why Bilbo looks like this? He resembles the kind of ugly figure you'd see on the shelf at your grandma's place. Look at how the eyes are drawn with these big white pupils and a large dark brown cornea. He's got these big visible eye bags accompanied by a large bulbous nose and these nearly perpetually visible front teeth, all contained in this round, squashed face, framed by slightly curly red-brown hair, the entire thing resting on a rotund belly and a face full of wrinkles. Part of my dislike is simply that I'm quite fond of Bilbo's appearance in the 2003 Hobbit video game, so maybe I'm just a little biased. But if you take a look at the entire cast of characters, they're all drawn just as ugly. The reason is the characters are drawn by one man, Lester Abrams. Lester actually illustrated Bilbo and Gollum on the February 1974 issue of Children's Digest, which is how he got the job from Arthur Rankin. Of course, when you compare his work to the 1972 announcement poster where the hobbits are stout humans with barrel bodies, and it's clear that his work was an improvement, marginally at least. Abrams himself credits Arthur Rackham as an inspiration for his artwork. Rackham was also a favorite of Arthur Rankin, and the inspiration comes through within the backgrounds of the film. Rackham was a European illustrator, famous for his inked and watercolor drawings. Rackham's work ranged from these lighthearted fairy tale illustrations to more somber pieces that accompanied Richard Wagner's operas and Edgar Allan Poe's poems. And I'd argue that a combination of whimsy and somber expressionism is essential to The Hobbit, both the book and this movie. Compare the anthropomorphic trees in Rackham's work with their squashed faces and their twisted arms to the atmosphere of how Mirkwood is drawn. It helps portray Mirkwood as a kind of dark forest you would see in a fairy tale. In fact, Rackham was the inspiration for Gustav Tengren, who was the illustrator in charge of atmosphere and styling for Disney's Snow White. That's why the forest looks like this in Snow White, though Rackham's influence is more apparent in the concept art. But what of Rackham's influence for the characters? Well, starting us off is Bilbo. This isn't Bilbo, this is more art by Arthur Rackham, and I stumbled across this piece and immediately recognized it for what it was, because I'd recognize that ugly Bilbo from a mile away. Bilbo is arguably the main character of The Hobbit, so Rankin Bass hired Orson Bean, an American actor and frequent talk show guest, to voice the character. Orson considered himself a decent choice for a hobbit, having reached 50 and found comfort in his homes and things. He does a decent take of Bilbo as a fussy creature reluctant to take on the journey.
Dear me, no. We hobbits are plain quiet folk. Adventures make one late for dinner.
Acting as Bilbo's foil is Thorin, who looks like Grumpy accidentally walked into the movie. And that's probably because Lester used the same Rackham art that was the basis for Grumpy. It's a decent interpretation for Thorin, who goes from doubting Bilbo's ability, becoming a foil to his antics, and then becoming just a bit fond of the Hobbit, until the ending at least.
Extinguish me!
There we go. There we go. Always glad to help a friend.
I can't tell you how grateful I am.
Oh, never mind that. What did you burgle?
The other dwarves don't really bear mentioning since they fall into the background to the point that 9 of them are voiced by the same actor. Gandalf is here with a hood instead of his hat, but he's shown with more power than his book version. He recognizes Bilbo's ring as the One Ring immediately and even summons the Dawn Sun instantaneously. He's voiced by John Huston, the director of The Maltese Falcon, who does his best interpretation of Fred Jones, saying treasure.
And they're carrying treasures from the pyramid before the treasures are smuggled out of the country. The stolen treasures.
If you prefer, you can say expert treasure hunter. An army of goblins with claim to the treasure comes from the north.
Speaking of treasure, Gollum shows up here as a uniquely frog-like interpretation of the small and slimy creature, in contrast to Abrams' original artwork and the popular depictions of the corrupted Hobbit. His need for the ring is portrayed by comedian Brother Theodore's voice acting, and together this creates a Gollum who's portrayed less sympathetically than the more famous performance by Andy Serkis.
Long ago, a golden ring, a magic ring.
Contrasting the amphibious cave frogman is Smaug, who's drawn more mammalian with a cat-like face and fur on his body. Richard Boone provides the voice for the arrogant creature, and while it can be dry, it's still my favorite performance here.
Revenge, you have. I am Smaug. I kill where I wish.
Smaug also has developed headlights for eyes, an interpretation of the novel's description of his inherent glow, but without that description, it just looks like he has flashlights for eyes. The elves are shown here as almost two different species. Elrond is more akin to the fair folk of Tolkien's book, with this glowing halo, but the wood elves are some sort of strange, small, goblin-like things with gray skin. Speaking of the goblins, they show up as these bulky monsters with large heads, wide mouths, and odd fashion choices which were meant to be Roman centurion armor. The best thing about these goblins is that their singing voice is provided by Thurl Ravenscroft. Ravenscroft not only has the perfect gothic horror name, but he was also the original Tony the Tiger.
Tony the Tiger.
What outfit from Tiger?
Sugar Frosted Flakes by Kellogg's out of Battle Creek.
And yes, I said singing voice. This is a Rankin Bass movie, so they made sure to fill it with as many songs as they could. Despite contemporary criticism of the music being added to make money off of record sales, there's actually only one completely original song in this movie, sung by folk singer Glenn Yarborough. Called The Greatest Adventure, it embodies Bilbo's motivation for the journey.
The greatest adventure is what lies ahead. Today and tomorrow are yet to be said.
The rest of the music adapts and expands on the songs, poems, and riddles that Tolkien had in his original book, with the lyrics being created by Jules Bass, the bass in the Rankin Bass. In practice, though, the movie has whole sequences where there is no dialogue but the characters just mill about or walk with the music overlaid. Glenn Yarborough's Greatest Adventure comes up often in the slower moments to remind more dim-witted viewers that a great adventure lies ahead. My favorite song, though, is the Goblin Town theme, which I can imagine the goblins probably sing to themselves when they have no captives. In the days leading up to its premiere, Rankin maintained that they'd added nothing that wasn't in the original book, and aside from talking eagles, that holds true. Some of the events are rearranged to compress the book into 78 minutes. The dwarves show up in the beginning together, the wood elves only appear once in Mirkwood, and the time in Lake Town and on the Lonely Mountain is cut down. Bjorn's also been removed entirely. According to Abrams, the original plan was to keep Bjorn, but remove the spiders, but he lobbied for the spiders to come back in. Compared to Jackson's 3-movie adaptation, this does a pretty good job in retaining the story and theme in under 78 minutes, with one major exception. They've turned Bilbo into a coward. Now, if you remember the book, Bilbo steals the Arkenstone and keeps it with him out of concern for Thorin and the dragon sickness. He then hands it over to the elves and men, hoping to end the hostilities, which causes a fallout between him and Thorin, until Thorin realizes Bilbo was right and promptly kicks the bucket. The Arkenstone has been removed from the story entirely, so instead Bilbo and Thorin have a falling out over the point of war, as Bilbo simply wants to give up. Later on, during the Battle of the Five Armies, Bilbo reiterates his confusion over war when he sees the elves and dwarves put aside their differences to battle the goblins.
Oh, great elf king, my truest friend and ally, we must join our forces against this common scourge.
But of course, O noble king under the mountain.
Now, the quick turnabout and awkward dialogue made me burst out laughing. It was really Thranduil's Austrian accent that I found the most hilarious part of all of this. The entire thing confounds Bilbo even more, and he decides to just leave and take a nap instead.
Thorin is correct. I simply do not understand war. 5 armies now? Mr. Bilbo Baggins. Enough is enough.
In the book, Bilbo is willing to join the fight in order to defend the Elf King and only misses out because he hurts his head and is knocked out for the rest of the battle. Here he runs off on his own and wakes up and lies to an injured Bomber about his absence.
Bomber, you're hurt.
I still live. And you?
A slight wound, crack on the head. Out for hours.
While I won't begrudge the exclusion of the Arkenstone or Bilbo's more anti-war stance, I told the line and making him a coward who abandoned the dwarves on the battlefield. I'll still give this film a 10 out of 10. I recommend watching it because it's historically the first full-length screen adaptation of any of Tolkien's work, and it's competently made, even if it can be ugly to look at. In fact, it probably isn't remembered today simply because people found it so ugly. But while Rankin Bass was busy making their Ugly movie, another big RB figure in the industry was busy working on Lord of the Rings. One Ralph Bakshi, a man whose films are as beloved as they are hated. If you're unfamiliar with Bakshi, he's a director best known for a number of raunchy, controversial animated films. He adapted the comic strip Fritz the Cat as the first X-rated animated film. Interestingly, Robert Crumb, who created Fritz the Cat, killed the cat off because he disliked Bakshi's film so much. But Bakshi was primarily known for urban movies, so his work on Lord of the Rings is a strange outlier in his animated history. Why was he so intent on making Lord of the Rings? Well, he came across news of John Boorman's script, and it shocked him so much that he made frequent trips to United Artists, petitioning them to give him a chance to do the book's justice. United Artists agreed, but only if Bakshi could come up with the $3 million necessary to buy out John Boorman's script. Bakshi managed to get the funding together with help from MGM president Dan Melnick. And then Dan got fired, and MGM replaced him with Richard Shepard, who didn't care for the books and dropped the movie. Bakshi needed the money fast to hold on to the rights, and he followed the golden rule of Breaking Bad. When you're in trouble, you'd better call Saul. Saul Zentz, that is. I've never watched Breaking Bad, so I actually have no idea if Saul is some sort of heroic figure, though I would assume so based on the name of his sequel series. Saul and Bakshi flew to England to meet with Tolkien's daughter to ensure that their goal of being faithful to the books was met. Their first step now was to write a script that could hold up to that promise. In walks Chris Conkling, a medieval scholar who offered his aid on the style and design of the movie. Bakshi and Conkling eventually wrote up to 6 different scripts as they attempted to pin down the story. They settled on 2 films, with the first one beginning with Merry and Pippin narrating the story to Treebeard until they would catch up to the present and to the second movie. Eventually they brought in Peter Beagle, the man behind The Last Unicorn, who decided to drop Merry and Pippin's flashback framing and split the story at the Battle of Helm's Deep and just as Gollum takes Frodo and Sam to meet Shelob. With a finished script in hand, Bakshi flew to England to recruit the voice cast and then to Spain to actually shoot the movie. If you've never heard of Bakshi's film, you might wonder how exactly they were going to shoot a movie that was supposed to be animated. Let me introduce you to rotoscoping. You can't see it, but I just did some very bland jazz hands. Rotoscoping is simply drawing over the actual live-action frames of a scene in order to capture the fluid, realistic movement. Bakshi sought to film the action and battles in live action and then rotoscope them. But while filming in Spain, he eventually decided to rotoscope the entire movie, as he saw how difficult it could be to animate the subtle movements, shadows, and weight of the characters from your imagination.
You can't animate that realistically. You can't. From pure imagination, you can't. It's impossible.
This wasn't a welcomed decision. Many of Bakshi's animators objected to this, and he ended up hiring quite a few animators fresh out of college, including a young Tim Burton. For the actual filming, smaller scenes were made in Los Angeles, where Bakshi would play the character recordings and the physical performer would mouth along to the voice and mime the script actions. Bakshi's goal was to ensure that his rotoscoping was not the cartoony, exaggerated approach that Disney tended to use in their movies. He wanted a neutral, realistic approach to the animation that had never been seen before. In theory. In practice, however, this is what his film actually looked like.
No, not even a dragon's fire could harm that ring.
Dropped a stone.
Fool of a took! Throw yourself in next time. Be quiet.
Fly, fly, the enemy is upon us.
Unfortunately, realism would require frequent, subtle movements from the actors, who preferred to move and gesticulate as if they were amateur theater performers. Gandalf is the worst of the bunch, with his explanation of the 9 rings being punctuated by a random pacing and twirling.
One ring to rule them all. One ring to find them. One ring to bring them all. And in the darkness bind them.
This isn't to say that all the rotoscoped animation is bad. Bilbo's reaction to Gandalf's story is a good capture of the actor's reaction, and it's a realistic portrayal of emotions.
No, but why ruin it?
In fact, many of the quieter conversations are a pleasant scene to watch because of how the actors are captured in animated form.
So all you had to do was say, friend, and enter.
Those were happier times.
Bakshi has a tendency in his films to take a mixed media approach, and he tries doing a similar thing here. Treebeard and the Watcher in the Water show up as more traditional animation, and some cells were directly painted on rather than having the footage be traced and painted. The opening animation for this summarizes the history of the One Ring and Golem by filming actors in silhouette. But chief among all of his styles for this film is pseudo-solarization, or Sabatier effect. If you've noticed any of the scenes I've shown you so far that some characters have strange black shading on them, it's because of Bakshi's cinematographer. As he explains,
I talked to Raph about solarizing the film, and process it to lab. And when you solarize film, it looks almost like a drawing.
In essence, solarization takes the lines between 2 large contrasting tones and inverts them, giving a sketchbook feel to the drawings. But how did this actually look in the film?
England upon the British Freeport, jumped over the moon. Look at him!
The orcs are the best example of these tones. The black bodies and green tunics end up merging together until the orcs begin to resemble a bit of a shapeless mass of limbs and faces that seems to embody the otherworldly power of Sauron. And frankly, it's an amazing choice. The Nazgul also use this process, with the actors initially portraying them as shambling, twitching zombies that obey the command to bring back the One Ring. But was this a necessary process? As Bakshi recalls, for some of his scenes that were filled with characters, it could take up to a week for just one frame to be animated. So the process itself is a lifesaver. Rather than animating each frame and taking weeks to complete the movie, they could cut down on time and churn out the frames in a matter of days. And all of this worked until the movie began to run out of money. You see, as the film goes on, more and more characters begin to show up as only solarized footage, from the guests at the Prancing Pony to Theoden's guards to the riders of Rohan. By the last third of the movie, most of the human warriors are just solarized footage, and even the orcs begin to lose the painted-on features they have, like their fangs and eyes. And some of the close-ups, you can even see the gorilla mask that they had the orcs wear. Solarizing certain groups and sections of the movie could have been all fine and dandy, But many characters begin to transition from rotoscoping to solarization in no coherent way. Some characters even shift from their live-action footage to being rotoscoped and back, depending on whether they're going to move or if the main cast might interact with them. The animation begins to get messier and messier later on you go into the movie, and it begins to look less animated and more like a live-action film, which critics pointed out to Bakshi, who argue that it's still counted as animation.
Some of the animation and some of the action, Mr. Bakshi, appears that we still have some of the live action with maybe just a suggestion of animation over it. Is that so?
No. You know, if I use live action, and I would say it because 4 of my films had live action in it. This is just hand-drawn, which makes it different. You know, am I clear? Had I used live action, I would have denied it for a second.
There aren't any official numbers for how many animators Bakshi actually hired. There have been some claims of 150 animators, but Bakshi has also recounted over 3,000 people working on the film. Whatever the amount, he and his crew only had 2 years to script, film, and produce the entire movie, and then animate a whole new movie on top of that. But while the animation had its own set of issues, the actual live-action shooting was just as problematic. Bakshi has often recalled a story where the crew called lunch early, and all of his actors abandoned right before the beginning of a big shot for the final battle of the film. He only managed to salvage that entire day by filming the actors leaving and redrawing them as the orcs abandoning the battlefield. The shooting in Spain wasn't the only problem. In fact, in his book Unfiltered, The Complete Ralph Bakshi, Ralph claims that the Spanish studio they hired to develop the film footage actually attempted to destroy the entire movie. They saw quite a few shots where you could see the airplanes, cars, telephone poles, and urban features in this fantasy film, and they feared that it would destroy Spain's reputation and credibility as a filming location if this footage ever made it out. I find this story hard to believe because it's predicated on the idea that the Spanish studio couldn't wrap their heads around rotoscoping. The only source seems to be Bakshi himself, and nothing in the book corroborates the story. In fact, the book also claims that at one point Disney owned the rights to The Lord of the Rings and tried to film an adaptation starring the Beatles. This is blatantly false, as Disney never held the rights to either Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. They considered adapting The Hobbit into Fantasia, and Walt Disney at one point even wanted to adapt The Lord of the Rings, but they eventually dropped both options for being too complex to fit in their works. And the Beatles version had nothing to do with Disney. It was an attempt by United Artists and Apple Films to fulfill a contractual obligation for a Beatles movie, but they couldn't even decide which Beatle would play which character before the whole movie and the entire band fell apart. Speaking of British rock bands, Bakshi wanted to hire Led Zeppelin to be the music for the movie. Saul Zaentz declined the idea as he had his own record label, and Led Zeppelin was contracted out to a different one, which meant that he couldn't profit from their music. Instead, a orchestral score was commissioned from Leonard Rosenman, the man behind the music of Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, which sounds like a sci-fi version of The Hobbit, if you ask me. The whales are the gold, the probe is Smaug, Spock is just an antisocial space Legolas. It makes sense. But speaking of things that make sense, what did they have to cut from the books to squeeze in the journey? Bakshi maintained that his adaptation would be faithful to the books, and to his and Peter Beagle's credit, the movie lifts whole scenes and lines from the book accurately. But they also cut enough that a person who doesn't know the original story will be left confused, which contemporary reviews corroborate. At one point in the beginning, Gandalf attempts to show Bilbo the inscription on the ring by throwing it into the fire. He pulls it out with no writing on the ring and instead begins his pacing rant describing the history of the rings. Tom Bombadil is cut out entirely from this movie, though strangely enough he did get a figure for the movie, along with one for the innkeeper. At the inn itself, the group meets Aragorn, who tells them he was sent by Gandalf, but he has no proof as the letter from Gandalf was cut out of the story. At the council in Rivendell, Aragorn displays the shards of Nazrul, which later shows up reforged and unmentioned. And there are a number of orphan lines in the scene which result in characters responding to information that hasn't been said, including Boromir objecting to hiding the ring, an option that was never mentioned in the film. Arwen herself is removed from the story, and Legolas shows up as a Rivendell elf. The Uruk-hai are gone, and Aruman's role is reduced to the beginning of the movie where his treachery is revealed, and to the end where he gives a speech to the orcs. Speaking of Aruman, let's talk about the character designs and changes done here.
I must go south now to consult with the wizard Aruman.
Instead of Saruman the White, we have Aruman, the guy who wears red. If you're wondering why I'm not pronouncing the S, Saul Zaentz thought that Saruman and Sauron were too similar as names, and he had the name changed to prevent confusion. This memo didn't get around the office completely, and so the movie uses both names to refer to Aruman.
I have come for your aid, Saruman the White, in troubled times.
The Balrog shows up as the solarized footage of a man with a lion head and butterfly wings, who ends up flying around and keeping distance from Gandalf. This is primarily because, while Gandalf is rotoscoped, Balrog is solarized, and neither actor can fully portray the massive height difference between the two characters in the book. Frodo is presented closer to his book version, willing to fight and be an active part of the quest.
Let go, Gollum! Let go, or I'll cut your throat! Don't hurt us! Don't let them hurt us, precious!
Especially during the flight to Rivendell, where he stands up to the riders until the river washes them away.
By all the Shire, you shall have neither the ring nor me!
This scene is different than Peter Jackson's rings, where he uses it to introduce Arwen. Bakshi swaps Glorfindel for Legolas, and we meet the cheery elf early, who happens to be voiced by C-3PO himself. Gimli is here too, but he falls to the background with very little significance to the plot, unlike Boorman's version. Boromir is drawn as a man with Viking horns who happens to wear no pants. Neither does Aragorn, for that matter. Both men wear tunics, and while I can't tell for sure if this is accurate to Conkling's research, I can say that I didn't expect to see a half-naked Aragorn and Boromir for half of the movie. In fact, there's some scenes where the characters accidentally flash you as they do high kicks while battling the orcs. Merry and Pippin are here too, drawn similar to Frodo, and their hair colors are the only way for me to tell them apart, an issue which I also had with the live-action Lord of the Rings. But strangest of all is their interpretation of Sam. Instead of being, say, similar to 1977's Ugly Bilbo, we get an oafish Sam. There's no other way to describe this character. They took the noble, humble gardener and turned him into a bumbling oaf needed to provide comic relief.
Me go, sir. Me go and see the elves. Oh, my. Oh, hooray!
It's not until the end of the movie that he loses the bumbling, though he still resembles an oaf. But aside from Sam, none of the characters are significant departures from their book version. In fact, up until Boromir's death, the movie's adaptation of The Fellowship of the Ring is well made, aside from the questionable animation choices. Boromir's death itself is a wonderfully directed and animated scene as you see the Vikings slowly pass away and the three men crowd around his body lamenting his death. If the movie had ended here like Peter Jackson's first film, it might be best remembered as a great adaptation that didn't get to see itself completed. But instead, we get a film that starts to fall apart as it heads into the Two Towers, and speeds through in an attempt to cram what remains before the battle at Helm's Deep. Pippin and Merry are captured by the orcs and marched to Isengard as Aragorn and friends attempt to track down the group. There's a funny scene here where Aragorn's physical actor stumbles while running, and the animators rotoscope the fall into the film, which is the only highlight of the strange running sequence. The orcs are attacked by the rotoscoped riders of Rohan, which allow Pippin and Merry to escape into the woods and be picked up by Treebeard, and that's the last we see of them. The rest of the Fellowship runs into Gandalf, who explains his fight with the Balrog through a series of well-made dramatic paintings. Strangely, there's a deleted scene of Gandalf versus the Balrog, which is animated in 2D, posted by Bakshi's son a few years ago. The group go to meet Theoden, where they dispatch Wormtongue and recruit the king to their cause, along with a quick introduction of Éowyn for the next movie. The story moves into Helm's Deep, which suffers the most from the solarized footage and bad directing of the live-action shoots. At multiple points of the story, we see both orcs and humans standing around doing nothing, as the animators simply ignore the processed characters unless one needs to fight or be injured. The most we see is their hair flowing in the wind or a cape flapping every once in a while.
I like this place. There is good rock here. This country has tough bones.
During the actual battle, swords rarely hit the characters in a realistic way, and we only see blood when the arrows are drawn hitting a character. At one point, we see the orcs trying to batter down the wall of Helm's Deep, while there are open doors to their left and right, including one that Aragorn and Legolas walk through in order to kill them. The entire battle drags on for too long in its entirety, all colored underneath this deep red tint, as nothing of consequence happens until Gandalf and the riders show up and rout the orcs and end the battle. Peppered throughout this part of the film are scenes of Frodo and Sam as they row down the river and travel to Mordor. The twosome run into Gollum, who is depicted as a grey skeletal shambler that reminds me of the zombie from Scooby-Doo's Which Witch is Which. Frodo subdues Gollum until he agrees to help them. Rather than crawling or scrambling around, this version of Gollum is frequently drawn walking upright, and he's portrayed often as more Smeagol than Gollum. And ultimately Gollum decides to lead Frodo and Sam to Shelob, which is where the story ends. Or rather, this is where it was supposed to end. Peter Beagle claims that the film would end on the Shelob cliffhanger, but that Saul Zaentz flipped the reels around in order to end with Gandalf's arrival and give a more conclusive ending scene. A claim that Saul denied. The actual film ends at Helm's Deep with Gandalf declaring,
"The forces of darkness were driven forever from the face of Middle-earth by the valiant friends of Frodo. As their gallant battle ended, so too ends the first great tale of The Lord of the Rings."
This is actually a redub for the DVD release, as the original print has no voiceover for this scene, and eventually ends with a declaration that the first part of the story has just ended.
Here ends the first part of the history of the War of the Ring.
Bakshi's film was originally going to be released with a Part 1 subtitle, but Saul Zaentz and his gang scrubbed that idea, believing that people wouldn't watch half a story. Bakshi fought over this, and eventually split from the film altogether, dropping his plans for Part 2. While Bakshi's adaptation made a significant profit, it was largely viewed as a flawed, unfinished film, and the public quickly moved on from it. Its legacy today is that it was a good first attempt at adapting The Lord of the Rings, but it was primarily marred by its animation and choppy storytelling. It's still worth checking out today just to see the first attempt at a Lord of the Rings movie and to see the film that inspired Peter Jackson. I should also mention that Ralph Bakshi hates Peter Jackson. Jackson stayed silent during production, but eventually admitted that he had seen this film when he was younger and was inspired by it to read the books. He even pays homage to it with this scene specifically, inspired by Bakshi's own version. But there's also this more important scene of the hobbits cowering under the tree from the Nazgul that made its way into Jackson's movie. Bakshi's version inspired the illustrator John Ho, who went on to work on The Fellowship of the Ring and slipped in his illustration, believing that the scene was originally from the book. Bakshi, however, holds that Peter Jackson actually ripped off that scene, and that the entire movie is not an homage, but a ripoff that he was never given proper credit for. There's no proof that Peter Jackson ripped off Bakshi's movie wholesale, but Bakshi has claimed that Jackson had no right to adapt the movie, and that Jackson's assistant even secretly bought Bakshi's cells and backgrounds to help kickstart the production of the New Line films. This last accusation is the strangest one. Ralph Bakshi has held the opinion over the years that his work was the first to put Middle-earth into visuals. While his film was the first big-screen adaptation, this claim ignores the major work of both Tolkien's own illustrations and the Tolkien calendars that were drawn over the years. In fact, the 1976 calendar features an illustration of Galadriel by the brothers Hildebrandt that Bakshi's work resembles heavily. At the very least, Jackson's backgrounds don't evoke Bakshi because they are not paintings or drawings, but the real New Zealand landscape which stands in for Middle-earth. The jury is still out on whether you can consider Jackson's movie a ripoff of Bakshi or not, and it ultimately depends on your personal interpretation of what counts as an homage or a ripoff. And these days, when he is not talking about Lord of the Rings, Bakshi makes appearances in podcasts and interviews where he talks about his old movies, claims all computer animation is actually rotoscoping, and usually sells his paintings and old animation cells for a few $1,000s. Bakshi has often stated his intent to make part 2 of Lord of the Rings if he is given the opportunity, but this seems more unlikely as the years go on. Speaking of sequels and ripoffs, it's a commonly held belief by people that Rankin Bass made Return of the King in order to bank off of the sequel vacuum left behind by Bakshi's movie. Indeed, Saul Zaentz and Bakshi even sued the company to prevent the special from airing. As the New York Times interview and concept art dates show, The Return of the King was already being developed in 1976 alongside the Hobbit film. Now, The Hobbit may have been in the public domain, but Return of the King was released pretty close to its film adaptation, so how could it be adapted with no copyright issues? We journey now to the complicated and boring world of U.S. copyright codes. The U.S. edition of Fellowship of the Ring was published in 1952. During that year, U.S. Code Title 17, Chapter 1, Squiggly Thing 16 required that books be completely manufactured in the U.S. in order to be copyright protected. There were some exceptions, including one that allowed a publisher to import copies from another country and be granted 5 years of protection, provided 3 rules. No more than 1,500 copies were imported. Each book would have a copyright notice printed that detailed who held its rights, and that the book would be manufactured in the US by the end of those 5 years. While the first 2 Ring books sort of held to these rules, Return of the King had never been properly registered. It also had over 1,500 copies imported, and many of those lacked the disclaimer. This was something caught by Rankin Bass, which they brought up in the lawsuit, but eventually they agreed to pay a certain amount of royalties. So after settling the lawsuit from Zaentz, Return of the King aired on TV in 1980. And it was a complete mess. During production, the film was called Frodo, Hobbit 2, and it generally holds to that idea. The film visually resembles the first Hobbit movie, and it even has the same amount of music sequences, though this time all of it is original music. But this is to its detriment, being a Hobbit sequel, that is, not the music. As Arthur Rankin Jr., part 1 of the Rankin Bass, puts it,
subsequently, we made another Tolkien, The Return of the King, the last book. We shouldn't have made it, because to take that story and condense it was not good.
Rankin Bass had to condense the plot of the first 2 books into the first 2 minutes of this movie, along with a recap of The Hobbit, in order to make the story as coherent as possible and attempt to match the tone of the original. Their solution to this issue was lots of cuts and lots of exposition. The movie starts with Gandalf providing a book blurb for the plot before jumping to the end of the story, where he, Elrond, and the 4 hobbits meet to celebrate Bilbo's birthday. Right off the bat, this scene removes the tension from the story for new viewers, as you now know who survives the story. Gandalf also brings along Glenn Yarborough, who is there to explain to Bilbo what has happened through the power of song.
We have brought with us someone who has written a ballad about the adventures of Frodo, the minstrel of Gondor.
Frodo of the 9 fingers and the Ring of Doom.
The actual plot follows 2 different storylines. The first follows Sam on his journey to free Frodo from the orcs and take him to Mordor. This journey is punctuated by sequences of songs and daydreaming, including one where Sam imagines himself as king.
Hail, Samwise the Strong! Hail the Conqueror! Hail the War King! Hero of the age! To the Dark Tower! To Barad-dûr!
Where The Hobbit managed to tell a coherent story and have its music, this movie struggles to do both. At 20 minutes into the film, we have gone through 3 such sequences. Aragorn has yet to appear aside from 2 small, silent cameos, and in fact they've cut out Legolas, Gimli, and Faramir. And without those previous 2 films, there are many orphaned events that make no sense. The orcs kidnap Frodo and kill each other over his cloak rather than the mithril vest he wears in the book. The Phial of Galadriel is used by Sam to defeat the Watchers, but there's no explanation given for its power or presence.
In a pocket, I found this. It has powers. It got me past the Watchers. What is it?
The Phial of Galadriel. I can say no more. But if I betray the trust and give the secret, its powers will die.
Gollum returns for his ring, but the story of Smeagol is cut entirely, with the journey ending as a happy Gollum dances, trips, and falls into Mount Doom.
Mine! Yeah! Mine! Ring! Mine! Ring!
This part of the story gives me a headache, and I'm going to take a break before I return and tell you of the absolute joke that is the Gondor half of the story.
Me for a good smoke while we wait. What say, Master?
Good notion, Sam.
Gandalf's narration establishes that the battle at Minas Tirith lasts for days, from Frodo's capture to his arrival at Mount Doom. This is a bit of an explanation for why in this film Gandalf is so hopeless, as he simply waits in the city believing that there is no chance left for their victory.
Is there no hope?
None, unless the ring be destroyed. But alas, it is lost with its bearer Frodo. All is gone. I, Gandalf, was without hope.
Denethor has set himself on fire, the Black Fleet is arriving, Aragorn is nowhere to be seen, Merry has yet to return with Theoden's forces, and for all he knows, Bilbo has failed in the quest for the ring. Meanwhile, the city is under attack from both the old goblins and the weirdly fleshy Nazgul who are on flying horses. Who are on flying Pegasuses, that's the word. Eventually, the Witch King shows up, sounding like a cross between Skeletor and Starscream.
Dost thou not know the prophecy? No living man may hinder me!
Theoden and his forces appear to save the day, with Éowyn squaring up against the Witch King. Merry, voiced by Casey Kasem of Shaggy Rogers fame, has to provide an explanation to Pippin for who she is and how she got there.
'Tis Lord Theoden's niece. She wanted to ride with us, but he forbade. She disguised as a knight and she came hither.
At this point of the story, with only 20 minutes left, Aragorn finally appears, having taken over the Black Fleet off-screen. As this movie skips over the Fellowship and his introduction, Aragorn is presented as an arrogant warrior who doesn't know the cast or understand their mission. He decides to march on Mordor to defeat Sauron, not believing in the quest to Mount Doom.
Why so glum, wizard? Does the mere thought of Sauron's vast forces overwhelm your spirit?
This war is without final hope. Victory cannot be achieved by force of arms, whether you sit here to endure siege after siege or march out to be overwhelmed.
Then, if the choice be mine, I choose to march.
As Sam tracks down Frodo, who has run off into Mount Doom under the ring's influence, Aragorn faces off against Sauron's army. It seems a hopeless match until suddenly the ground breaks apart, Sauron's army falls into the cracks, and the eagles fly everyone back to safety. We see Aragorn's coronation with what might be Faramir standing next to Éowyn, and the story catches up to the present.
The end of the ring, the return of the king, a new age has come to the land.
Frodo declares his intent to sail into the Grey Havens, and Gandalf muses that the hobbits will eventually grow as tall as men and become the same as them. The end. This story gives me a headache. It cuts out so much material and tries to make up for it with as much narration and descriptive music as it can.
The bearer of the ring, the wearer of the ring, he hears a voice compelling him.
And it is not worth seeing. In fact, there are only two redeeming qualities to this movie. The first is that we get to see Sam be the heroic character he is, unlike Bakshi's version. The second is one really good song that once again shows up from the Goblins.
Where there's a whip, there's a way. where there's a whip. We don't want to go to war today, but the Lord of the Lashes says, nay, nay, nay.
In an odd choice, this song establishes that the orcs are only fighting because they are enslaved to Sauron and are forced to fight. From a thematic choice, this brings to mind Tolkien's moral dilemma as to whether the orcs were created evil or were born with a sense of morality. And just like Goblin Town, Tony the Tiger makes this song stand out. But speaking of moral dilemmas, there's a point in this film where Sam decides to start a race war.
You wait. Men come before orcs. Get back. You going to stand for that, sir? Get back in line. You mean you're going to let a pack of filthy man creatures go before us? And you call yourself an orc? You're right.
And so, with one really disappointing movie, we come to an end of the first age of Tolkien movies. If my timing works out, this video will come out at the same time as the first anime Lord of the Rings movie, War of the Rohirrim, or as a lady at my work pronounced it, Rohirrim. Time will tell if Rohirrim will start a second age of animated movies, but I'm not hopeful of it. When news of the movie first came, it was reported that the film was made to keep the rights with New Line Cinema. These kinds of movies are called ashcan copies, and they don't always result in good movies. Just look at the 1994 Fantastic Four movie, or even the 2015 one. So who knows what Rohirrim will be like. Maybe in 40 years we might get the whole scoop on it and we can look back on it more fondly. I might go and take a look at the film, and if I have a chance I'd love to leave a review of it. But I'll probably make another video where I'll cover a lost bonus Hobbit movie that most people have also never heard about. In the meantime, I'd like to leave a special shout out to Hogan's Alley, the cartoon art magazine I used to find the early concept arts for Return of the King. And if anyone wants a recommendation for a good example of rotoscoping, I recommend checking out the movies Loving Vincent and The Peasants, who are both rotoscoped and painted movies in the style of Van Gogh's paintings. Until next time, this has been Pepperjack presenting to you the forgotten Lord of the Rings movies.
Where there's a whip, there's a way. Where there's a whip, there's a way. Where there's a whip.